Good morning and welcome to the 5th Primary Colors of Education Conference by Network of Education Policy Centers. My name is Ulvia and today I have the honor to open this conference. Today we have participants from 20 countries, education specialists, teachers, researchers, teacher trainers, and this variety represents perfectly what the Primary Colors of Education Conference is meant to be: a place where we collect narratives about education from the network and wider. After almost 2 years from the beginning of pandemic, the discussion about the future of education is more than actual. And the biggest learning from the last year is that we need to work together, and the cooperation and dialogue are the only way possible to shape the future. NEPC does see our work and also this conference as a contribution to cooperation and dialogue. The 2 days conference has twofold aim: to reflect on approaches applied during the crisis and to propose possible directions for the education in the future. The future will be the topic for the second day of the conference on December 7th. Our today program is dedicated to inclusion, the interpretation, implementation, and monitoring of inclusive education, which is ongoing in many countries of NEPC region and wider. The pandemic shows that inclusive systems are more resilient in time of crisis and can provide adequate support to all learners. The panel discussions will present how inclusion and participation are represented in several members' national initiatives and international projects. I'm very pleased to introduce the opening speaker of this year's conference, Lana Jurko, NEPC Executive Director. Good morning, Lala. Lana will wrap up her experience in the field of inclusion and education, and to which extent inclusion is integrated as fundamental principle in educational system in our region. Enjoy the conference. Lana, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Olivia, for the introduction. I'm, of course, very happy that we are having another conference. Very unhappy that it's still online, but this is live these days, and I hope that although we are online, we will still manage to have a dialogue and to discuss the issues that we are all concerned about. It's a bit strange to have a keynote speaker on the conference who is from the organization that is organizing, but somehow when we were preparing this, we thought that the 2 years that we have spent really working on inclusion so deeply, that somehow I might be the person who can really wrap up everything that we've learned in the 2 years and start the discussion on this very important topic. So I will start. Sorry. So inclusion and inclusive education has been at the heart of our work from the very beginning of our network, now almost 15 years ago, although some of us have been working on it even longer. But however, in the last 2 years, we really had the opportunity, but also the urgency to dive even deeper into it. 2 reasons for this. On one hand, it was the UNESCO Regional Report 2021 on inclusion and education that examined the situation in the 30 countries of exactly the NEPC region, what we call the NEPC region in our family, but what actually consists of East and Southeast Europe, Caucasus, Central Asia, Turkey, and Mongolia. But it was also prompted by the emergency of the global pandemic on education and the fact that the pandemic and closure of schools has further deepened educational inequalities. And after 20 years of work in this field and almost 30 years of our systems in the region being in the reform process, one feels that we keep futilely repeating the same thing and nothing moves. So when I was preparing for this lecture, it almost felt like, is it worth it? I have nothing more to say than what I've said before. Everything was already said. However, the need to continue to advocate for inclusion and inclusion policies and practices has not ended. So we go on in hope that things will move further. We go on because we have not made it. The region covered by NEPC, and I would say even globally, we're still struggling on many levels to reach the standards and visions of authentic inclusion. We find ourselves still discussing and explaining the holistic understanding of inclusion. The all means all concept still eludes many. We often get caught up in debates on what is inclusion, whether inclusion is needed, and who is it for, and are commonly facing attitudinal barriers to inclusion from different stakeholder groups. This attitudinal barrier is something that we at NEPC are really working hard to break. The understanding that inclusion is for all and that it benefits all is something that really needs to be driven to the minds of everybody in the society, and then of course in particular to those working in education. The misconceptions and confusions of similar yet distinct concepts of equality, equity, and inclusion do not help our work. And the asynchronicity of inclusive reforms in the region also puts countries at different phases of implementation. However, as futile as it sometimes feels, progress towards a rights-based approach to inclusive education in the region has been made in the last 20 years. And the regional report that I've mentioned already does show this. Education levels, which were already high in our region, actually among the world's highest, have even increased rapidly in those 20 years. Out-of-school rates fell by half. Countries have been moving away from the medical models. The percentage of children with disabilities in special schools fell from 78% in 2005 to 53% in 2015. The percentage of children in residential institutions fell by 30% in the same period. So there has been progress, and schools are also making their support system broader and more flexible. In every country, we can find teachers and school leaders who are implementing authentic inclusion, and classrooms and even schools in which all really means all. Yet we also know that still many learners are not being supported and are suffering in non-inclusive contexts, while in some areas regression can also be noted. We can notice the policy gaps and often assuming that policies are okay, but we fail in implementation. This is many times true or often true. However, the policy gaps go both ways. And we have, as mentioned, classrooms and schools that are better than the policies of the countries. Politics and policies do fail the inclusion goal. From access to education, integrity of the system, content, both in the curriculum and textbooks of education, teacher preparedness, assessment, participation, all of this in policy level are still not where they need to be. So we need to continue working at the policy level, regardless of, although sometimes we see that policies might be better than what we see at implementation level. And although many things can be done at school level, and many of our members and a lot of our projects are working exactly on that level, the failure of politics and policies need to be addressed, as there is really no excuse in 2021 to have the situation that we have. So I will concentrate my presentation on the issues, on the policy issues, and try to illustrate with some data and example from our countries what is not being done well. So we still have many countries in the region that have not yet shed the legacy of segregated education. And this segregated education we don't see only in the special schools or schools that are intended for children with special educational needs, but also to linguistic minorities, ethnic minorities, and different ways in which we segregate our students. Overall, 1 in 3 students with special needs in Central and Eastern Europe are still placed in special schools. In Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia, the share of youth with disabilities in out-of-school population is twice as large as the share of them in the school population. In 50 of the 30 educational systems in our region, school admission still depends on medical psychological assessments and other selection procedures. What passes for inclusive may instead be a medical defined focus on disability. So we are not really clear in our definitions and in our policies how we understand inclusion. Other forms of segregation and discrimination persist and they hinder inclusion. For example, about 60% of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian youth in the Balkans do not attend upper secondary school, and only 3% complete it in Montenegro. Members of these groups are also disproportionately diagnosed with intellectual disabilities. And in Slovakia, Roma constitute 42% of those in special schools in 2018. We also have a big discrepancy with socioeconomic status of our students and their completion of education. So for example, in Mongolia, 94% of richest, but only 37% of the poorest complete secondary school. The issue of migration, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers is also quite bleak in many countries. And Turkey, which has made a great effort and has actually absorbed more than 600,000 Syrian students in public schools, still 37% of Syrian refugees are not in school in Turkey. And looking at how we understand inclusion at policy level, we can see that in 21 out of the 30 education systems, there are separate schools or classes for linguistic minorities. And this parallel provision often works against inclusion, as I've mentioned already. Gender inequality in education has become or still remains a highly contested topic. In several countries, a traditional gender lens reinforces gender stereotypes. This is true for our region, but not only for our region. And it's another issue that we need to continue working on. Another big issue is, of course, sexual orientation and gender identity, which is almost never mentioned in our schools or very little mentioned in our schools. And we have only 7 countries in the region who have policies or actions that explicitly address those issues. Inclusive education should encompass all learners. However, in laws and other documents, 19 out of the 30 education system reviewed in the region define special education needs in relation to disability, while 12 also include a variety of other learner groups. These tend to be mainly gifted learners. So we have now kind of 2 groups. The special needs, the gifted, we see them as something that needs to be worked on. And then we have a definition of those who are vulnerable. And out of these 30 countries, 20 focus on multiple marginalized or vulnerable groups. So these are beyond learners with special education needs or disabilities. But even with this expanded scope, it should be seen as just one step towards eventually moving away from any form of categorization or group-based definition of learner identification. So even in the systems that have a broader understanding, it's still not really an inclusive understanding. Inclusive education, as we all know, aims to dismantle barriers by relying on the principle that every learner matters and every learner matters equally. We know, and studies have shown, that inclusion can deliver improvement in academic achievement, in social and emotional development, self-esteem, and peer acceptance. Ensuring student diversity in mainstream classrooms and schools can prevent stigma, stereotyping, discrimination, alienation, and other consequences of such behavior, including radicalization. It can contribute to social justice, recognition of differences, and representation of all groups in education policies and programs. counteracting tendencies that allow exceptions and exclusions. Authentic inclusion takes place when the boundaries between mainstream and minority students cease to exist, where all students learn from one another and can achieve their full learning potential. While the equity approach, which we often see as equal to inclusion, but it's not. So while the equity approach, for example, preparing additional or different curriculum for those in need, may actually invite stigmatization. So we see the students in remedial classes as weak learners. An inclusive curriculum aims to install in all learners a positive sense of self-esteem and self-worth, as well as a sense of belonging in the school and therefore in the society. And this belonging in the school is one of the key elements of well-being of students. It's a motivation. It's actually good for everybody, and it's something that we really need to look at inclusion from this point of view of the student experience. So when we monitor inclusion, it's not only about the end result, but it's also about the process. And we really need to start looking at monitoring inclusion from the perspective of students' feelings, let's say, and how they feel in school. So we have, inclusion has the potential to more explicitly support not only the learning, but also the well-being of all learners. And in that way support the societal aim for diversity. So in this idea that we need to fulfill every learner's potential, the prerequisite for adequate policy response is to see learners' diversity not as a challenge, not as a problem, but as an opportunity. It is, of course, the reality that diversity exists in every classroom, in every school. It might not be diversity as we understand it, or as let's say in this common understanding of ethnicity or language or socioeconomic status. But diversity exists in every classroom, and it's important that we see these as opportunities. And I will now concentrate a little bit more on where the system fails or where the policies fail in the curriculum and textbooks. And although countries have provisions for equity in their curriculum, again, we are talking about equity rather than inclusion. And progress has been made in development, representation, as well as assessment adjustments to learners' abilities. The curricula still reflect political divisions that result in marginalized and stereotypical representation of the groups that lack political or social recognition in the respective societies. And it could be different groups in different countries, but it's important to understand that this power idea is definitely one thing that is blocking inclusion, and that is something that we need to fight for. When we look at textbooks in many countries, they confirm that much is to be done specifically in regard to gender equality, ethnic identity, and LGBTI. In some cases, as I said, there is even regression. So, for example, the Turkish curricula in 2016 removed content referring to gender equality from it. But even looking at just commonly the gender stereotyping in textbooks throughout the region is quite dramatic and needs to be addressed. Introducing inclusion principle in textbook review criteria on use of language and images should be a path forward. And although we do have examples of such reviews of textbooks, what we find is that the weight that inclusion has in selection of textbooks is actually too low for it to make a proper change. And still, many textbooks in our region actually promote stereotyping either ethnic groups or, if nothing else, glorifying the majority, which is also a way of stereotyping minority. LGBTI and Roma are the most invisible in the curriculum and textbooks across the region. As I said, only 7 countries have some kind of explicit prohibiting based on sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. And in the let's say most in Southeast Europe and Eastern Europe, where there is most Roma population, so 14 countries were examined, only nine out of these 14 do not mention Roma at all in their curriculum. So it's like they do not exist in our societies. Various models of adapted assessment are present in the region, and they do help learners demonstrate their progress. However, national assessment systems have a long way to go to become fully inclusive and respond to real individual need. The competitive systems that we have actually do not serve inclusion, and inclusion and competition in the same classroom actually do not work. So this is something that we really need to also think about when we do any kind of external assessment of our schools or our students, where we constantly do ranking, which is definitely not something that serves inclusion. And when we look at larger studies, global studies like PISA and so on, which do this at national level, and we know what happens with policies, and of course not in all countries, but often what is important for the policies or the politics is how better or how much better we are than our neighbors. And we are not looking at those results in the sense of trying to improve our systems, but if we are better than the neighbor, especially if this is a neighbor that we do not have great relationships with, then it's fine. And we can go on without really using the data that PISA and other external assessments do provide us to improve our systems. Another thing that is very important and that often happens in our region is that we try to do reforms one by one, and not understanding that actually, for example, curriculum, textbooks, assessment, they have to be done in parallel because they have a domino effect on one another. And if parallel changes are not done, actually the results of these reforms are not effective. There is let's say a commitment which can be seen as positive, and it was seen as positive, to provide education in students' home language. And more than 70% of the countries in the region provide schools or classes using the home languages or mother tongues of the students. However, there are dangers in such parallel provision, as some groups are taught apart according to different curriculum, and often the content on the minority history and culture is taught only to the minority themselves, leaving them as a part and not really part of the society. Inclusion, of course, is best served through bilingual schools where the ethnic groups learn together in both languages, and the common curriculum includes and is representative of both groups or three groups or however many groups we might have. But we have very few examples of that. One that we can point out is the Slovene-Hungarian schools in Slovenia. But as I said, it's a very rare exception. Curricula are also commonly adapted to learner needs through individualized education plans, which exist in almost all countries, usually mainly used for children with special education needs. However, procedures for developing and implementing them remain a challenge. Teachers do not feel totally prepared to use them. There is little cooperation between the learner, the teacher, the parent, or a specialist in providing those individual plans and really making the best out of them as they were imagined as a policy. We do need innovative, flexible solutions for some learners from remote areas, learners who might be from nomadic groups. We have some very good examples from Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Russian Federation, Uzbekistan, where they use adapting the school calendar, setting up mobile classrooms, and ensuring the curriculum is relevant to their learners. Again, there are lessons to be learned from that. I would say maybe the biggest problem that we face, although I'm a big curriculum fan, so I think what we say we will learn is very important. But one that we all know is the preparedness of teachers. We need teachers to be prepared, empowered, and motivated to teach all students. To achieve this, we need different teacher education. The teacher education that we have now, especially pre-service, should be based on is not based on inclusion paradigm, and it should be. Currently, initial teacher education mostly offers a few subjects on the topic and then tries to fill in the gaps through in-service training or continuous professional development, usually not systematically done, often only for the motivated teachers and those who really want to do it anyway. And we have large proportions of teacher force which is not really ready to teach in inclusive classrooms. And when you look at the data, among 14 countries in the region, only 50% of teachers from lower secondary school felt prepared to work in mixed ability classroom, and even less in culturally diverse classrooms. And this, I think, is really an alarming data for our region, because we don't have a single country which is not multicultural in some way. So we really need to work on that quite strongly. Another thing is school leaders or head teachers we know that they're essential in installing an inclusive school ethos, but programs that would support this in the region are not, there are not many. Actually, we see school leaders left almost alone in this task of trying to lead the school. There are just a few countries that have obligatory training for school leaders or licensing of school leaders. Often what happens, the best teacher becomes the school leader. In a way, this is a loss on both ways because we lose a teacher. Often our teachers, school leaders, are not teaching at all. We do have some exceptions in the region, but school leaders go mostly into management. And they are seen as managers of the school, but not as pedagogical leaders. And this is something that needs to be changed as well. The aging of the teaching force that we are facing makes the need to change even more pressing. We need to really kind of concentrate the in-service provision on teachers with more than 5 years of experience, and we really need to work quite strongly on that. The idea of changing pre-service education for teacher has been around for many years. We do have another, I would say, attitudinal problem there because the universities or the colleges that do teacher education are very resistant to this change. We have this constant say that they're autonomous institutions and that policy cannot influence universities as free institutions. And this creates a lot of problems. We have not seen yet how this can be solved. And I don't think we have really a very good example in the region of this, but this is something that needs to be discussed. And we need to open this discussion of pre-service education for teachers in a much stronger way than we are currently doing. So we know that teacher diversity shows commitment of the system to inclusion principles, but there is very little teacher diversity in our region. Mostly, again, we have a very set type of teacher in school, of course, very much gender oriented as well, so mostly women. And then we, of course, have the support personnel in the system that is lacking. We do have support system personnel, but not enough, and often buried in bureaucratic duties rather than working on issues that they should be working on. So with COVID-19 crisis, we have learned that teachers are essential workers. We also know that they are major agents of change in education. So we really need to support teachers to be the champions of inclusions. But we need to acknowledge that among teacher force, there are attitudinal barriers, and they are not really all for inclusion. How we break this barrier, I'm not sure, except for advocacy and working closely with teachers. The pandemic and school closures have made it even more difficult to reach the goals of inclusion. We've all seen that, while at the same time making it even more urgent. And the governments have responded with urgency to the pandemic in education. However, after almost 2 years in this situation, we do see that the most disadvantaged learners are further behind. And the policies are not actually following as quickly as they should. There are learnings from the pandemic on distance education solutions, on cooperation with parents in home environments that we should take forward. We need a larger focus on psychosocial support of learners and teachers. And finally, we really need to listen and provide spaces for learners' voices throughout the system. Participation of learners is really at the low level in the region, and this student voice is something that we need to work hard. The reality is that the need for strong and inclusive education policy is greater than ever, and we at NEPC are, of course, committed to this goal. I hope our conference will provide us with new ideas and motivation to continue on this path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you. Dear participants, maybe any questions, any comments, any reflections? You know, Lana, of course, I agree with many points you made, but I especially would like to stress the importance of raising voices, because uh, in this system where the top has some uh, images and mental patterns of what to do, and hides the inclusion and the equity, and hiding equality and inclusion, and packing this in equity of opportunities. And sometimes schools and teachers hiding their unwillingness to do inclusion behind the parents, that parents don't want, or so many. I think the raising voice, maybe it is the most important strategy, really, to say who thinks what and who wants what in terms of inclusion. Thank you very much. Thank you. If no questions and reflections, I would like to invite you and inform that now we're moving to the first panel. And welcome to the first panel. Lana, I think you will be moderating it.
Thank you very much. Yes, now I turn to a different hat and I start moderating our session. And I'm very happy that we will hear from several of our members in this session.